which alien species do you find most interesting?
I'm gonna just give you my candid thoughts. I think that the Nordics are fascinating because they display sort of an Earth conscientiousness. It almost feels like their belief that Earth homeostasis is like very important. Some say they come from the Hyperborean esoteric tradition. You know, if you have different root races, I find that to be very interesting in the sort of lore. And then I think the Greys are interesting too because it's like, what are they? They seem to be adhering to some mandate or operative when it comes to making these incisions, inserting microchips, you know, collecting genetic material. They often repeat, do not fear, or things like that. And then they seem sort of hominid in some ways. And so it brings up these ontologically interesting questions. Are they sort of, a la your great Twitter post, some von Neumann replicator, you know, part of some kit deployed by a more advanced extraterrestrial civilization? Are they robotic droids? Or are they us from the future having undergone some nuclear holocaust or whatever? So I find those two probably most fascinating. The third wrench I'd like to throw into this, and I realize I'm, you know, not answering this question in the most simple way, is I think the abductions involving human-on-human contact is some of the weirdest and most interesting. You know, when people say something takes over my brain and I don't know what it is, Mike Masters was at a convention, a UFO convention just like this one, and he claimed that somebody whose name I know, Eric Mitchell, took him aside at the conference and basically inserted or downloaded information into his brain. And that guy says, I don't know what happens to my brain, but sometimes I, you know, go into these sort of altered states and I, you know, crazy stuff comes out, and he downloads quantum physics and other things. So I would say that's, you know, if you're going for high strangeness, that's the weirdest thing.
Is there so that's a great example of a case. Is there a case where maybe those tall, blonde sort of Nordics, is there a case or some anecdote that you can share that was a little bit more interesting to you that just like kind of came up?
Yeah. I don't know. There are a few, you know, like there's the Ingo Swann at the supermarket, you know, saying this woman is ravishing. And I believe she was kind of this tall, blonde, you know, beautiful woman. Of course, you have the Holloman landing, although that might be more tall whites and Nordics if we're making a distinction there. You know, they had some like pharaonic headdress or whatever. I thought that was sort of fascinating. But, and then of course, you know, something we experienced together that our audiences will see at some point is Charles Hall, who spoke to the tall whites, spent a lot of time with them, but also the Nordic people with the 24 teeth. And, you know, all respect to Charles Hall. I think he was at Area 51, but that was a strange one. You know, he felt like, kind of robotic in some of his answers, and I don't quite know what exactly he experienced, but he seemed to think that the tall whites and the Nordics had, you know, different agendas, and that the teeth of the Nordics were somehow very important. But I don't know. I don't know if I have a singular experience that I would revert to.
Yeah, it's such an interesting choice. The Nordics. Literally everybody answered Nordics.
Really?
Yeah.
Whoa. It's interesting. Well, you kind of get the sense that, like, the Greys they're definitely not, they're at best kind of impervious and, like, doing some bidding of some higher level thing. I think with the Nordics, they feel more friendly towards humans and advanced and evolved. Maybe they have like orthogonal aims insofar as like if you're not treating the Earth right, they'll, you know, maybe commit violence against you or something. But there seems to be something interesting going on there. Do you have a theory as to why Nordics came up most?
Yeah, definitely. I think we're, you know, interested in things that are like us because this, you know, posits that maybe this is a perfect version of us somehow. Or, even Richard brought up the idea, and so did Stephen Bassett, of what are the odds that a beautiful version of a human being, this like perfect supermodel-esque like version of a human being, is made on a different planet and evolved the exact same way.
Yep.
Same amount of fingers, same eyes facing forward, same like all these little features. And so Richard says that maybe that is an evolutionarily optimal version of a surface-dwelling entity.
Yeah.
That like if you were on a planet like ours, that's how you would evolve largely.
Yeah, I think if you're just adhering to normal astronomy, Occam's razor would say that's not right, because you have all these different, atmospheric conditions, and, if you're in another planet, the likelihood of evolutionary convergence. I mean, we know now there's silicon-based life. So even just the idea of carbon-based life, let alone, we have 8 million species on Earth, 20 are, I think upright and bipedal or something. And, you have one, Homo sapien or whatever, and then you have a thing that looks exactly like it. So who knows? But if you take into account, we don't really understand the galaxies and our universe at large. And if you have some sort of information theoretic model of universes, maybe parallel worlds whereby things are being A/B tested, they could just be farther along in some sort of, test or whatever. And it would be hard to say. And so I do think there's something very interesting about them. That also could just point to them not being off planet at all. They could be, have off planet capabilities.
Breakaway civilization.
But in fact, that could point more towards the put off Silurian hypothesis of this ultra-terrestrial coexisting, beings on Earth. They have bases underwater, maybe at what we call Atlantis, but survivors of that civilization. Maybe they have bases in Antarctica or things like that or whatever. And they sort of weakly interact with mankind in ways to maybe, sway things a little bit here and there.
There's the Nazi connection too, obviously. Blonde, blue eyes being, part of the Third Reich, being like their ideal version of a human. And then you have, prior to that, the Magenta Crash, which some say featured these tall blondes as well.
Yeah. So, and then you have this guy, Peter Levenda, who wrote a book called The Unholy Alliance about Hitler's alliance with the tall whites, but maybe they were Nordics, in World War II. Who knows? But I will say there's some interesting facts around that. Hitler had only visited a few places before World War II started. Obviously, he was born in Austria. He was an artist or whatever. So there, Paris, obviously Germany. I might be missing one other country, but it's a short list. Finland is one of the countries that he went to, which is, I do find interesting. And then we know that the Nazis had a deep interest in Antarctica. That's also a fact. Their cover story, if you believe the alien version of this, is that there were butter rations going on at the time in World War II. So margarine is actually, there's a source of that is in Antarctica. And so they had to go down there to get the margarine. I don't know about that. I think, a la Heinrich Himmler, Rudolf Hess, all these guys who were high up, in his inner circle, were extremely interested in the esoteric. I mean, they had excursions to go look for the Holy Grail. They were interested in the Ark of the Covenant, and there are rumors that the Ethiopians moved the Ark of the Covenant during the, Italian occupation and stuff. Indiana Jones isn't that far off. Like, they were extremely in the, Heinrich Himmler had like a black sun on his, this all sorts of occult symbology. You had the Thule Society doing all sorts of weird stuff. And so you have to ask the question, does the Aryan thing, where does that come from? Well, it comes from, the Theosophical Society in the late 19th century, people like Madame Blavatsky. And what is the first root race? There are, 7 root races or whatever. I believe the second is the Lemurians. I believe the third is the Atlanteans. The first root race is the Hyperboreans, these sort of tall, white, earth conscientious creatures or whatever. So it's hard to say, but I do think that lore is fascinating. And then you get into these weird questions around, you have Joseph P. Farrell, who talks about, he thinks that all this stuff is Nazi. He thinks that the UFO crashes themselves are Nazi. And that Adamski, one of the first sightings, maybe he was a hoaxer, I don't know, but in 45, he's seeing a bell with Nazi paraphernalia or whatever. And Annie Jacobson's saying we went searching for the Horton brothers, these Nazi engineers. And so it does, bring up these interesting questions of, was there some sort of alliance? The final point I'll make is Philip K. Dick, great sci-fi author. He wrote a book called The Man in the High Castle about an alternate timeline where the Nazis actually won World War II. But he then made a speech at Metz in France in 1977. He said, if you think this world sucks, you should look at the others, something like that. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. But basically, he makes this speech and he says, the Man in the High Castle wasn't fiction. There's an alternate universe right now where the Nazis won World War II and they basically took over the U.S. along with the Japanese. And everybody in the audience is shocked and they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? And so this involves this sort of parallel, world model. Whitley Strieber is here and he talks about this missing paper from von Neumann where we need to think parallel timelines into existence. And so you have to ask the question, some of these UFO crashes, if we are engaging on some sort of timeline war at the highest level, are these UFO crashes, if any of them are sort of somewhat Nazi related? They say Kecksburg in 65 looked like the Nazi Die Glocke bell or whatever. Is it some sort of weak timeline interaction between, parallel timelines where, certain timelines are being fought for, you want to ensure the survival of a certain timeline or whatever. And if you can, affect, space-time in certain ways, maybe you come back in time and you try to ensure the survival of your timeline. And so maybe these crashes are sort of taking, are occurring outside of sort of Zeno's era of time and in this sort of larger ontological framework.
And that the tall whites might be somehow deeply implicated in this.
Maybe.
On some level.
Maybe.
Interesting. What's your conviction on the Nordics being real?
All low. It's a low on everything.
Yeah.
I don't know. The way I look at UFO research is that's not true. There are gradations of probability. There being a phenomena that's real, I'm very high conviction.
Yeah, of course.
Reality being weirder than we think.
But
very real.
The specific
Nordics, super low.
Super low, but not zero.
Not zero. Mm-hmm. Not zero.